With many images, you can remove a background automatically, but in some cases, when the background is a little bit more complicated or where the subject doesn't stand out quite as well from the background, you might need to manually remove that background. Fortunately, the process is rather straightforward. Let's take a look at that. I'll start off by clicking on the image that I want to remove the background from to make sure that image is selected. I'll then go to the Images and Shapes tab and then choose the Eraser tool. That will bring up the Remove Background workspace where I can begin defining my foreground object versus the background that I want to remove. Let's first take a look at the basic process involved. You'll first want to choose the Magic Edge tool and then paint along the edge of the foreground object that you want to remove the background from. Let's just assume that I only want the beak of the bird here, for example. I would trace along the edge of that area. Then I could define the foreground versus the background. So I'll choose the Select Foreground tool, the green circle, and paint inside the area of the image that I want to keep. This is sampling the color and tonal values that are in that area. I'll then choose the Select Background tool, and then I will paint across the background. This provides everything that is needed to extract a foreground object from the background. We're defining the boundary of that foreground object and determining which areas represent foreground versus background. Of course, in this case, I actually want to select the entire bird and extract it from the background, so I'll go ahead and clear my work here. I could undo one step at a time by clicking the Undo button. If I decide I don't want to undo that step, I could click the Redo button to essentially undo the undo. But in this case, I just want to start over altogether, so I'm just going to use the option to clear out my entire selection. Then I'll expand my preview area so that I can get a closer look at this toucan. So at the top right of the preview area, I'll click the double arrow button to expand that area. Then I'll once again choose the Magic Edge tool, and you can see that the circle that I'm using to paint is moderately large, but I can change that size. I can click the pop-up and choose a larger size or a smaller size. In this case, I think the medium size will work out pretty well because there are some fuzzy edges to this bird, but note that you can adjust that size depending on the area that you're working with. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'll start in the bottom left corner here, and then I will paint along the edge of my foreground object. Notice that as I'm painting, I'm getting that yellow outline indicating which portion of the image I have selected as the edge. This is the area of the image that will be analyzed in order to separate this object, this toucan in this case, from the background. So you'll want to make sure that you've covered up the entirety of that edge of the foreground object so that it can be separated from the background. Now that I've defined the edge of my foreground object, I need to specify which areas are foreground versus background. So I'll go to the Select Foreground tool, that's the green circle button, and I will click and paint inside of the toucan to identify that this is the foreground area. Then I'll choose the Select Background tool, that's the red circle, and I will paint across the background. So now that I've defined the foreground versus the background and the edge of my foreground object, I can process this result. I'll go ahead and click the Convert button, and that image will be processed so that the background can be removed. Overall, you can see that the result is very good, but I do have some areas at the top of the beak that don't look quite right. I'll go ahead and expand the view so that I can get a closer look, and I'll zoom in on the toucan, and you can see there are some notches in the beak. So I'll want to go back to my before image and clean things up there just a little bit. I'll go ahead and reduce the size of that after preview, and in fact I'll expand the view for my before image here. Maybe zoom in just a little bit closer and use the hand tool in order to pan down so I can see that area. And what I want to do is reduce the size of that edge selection here at the top of the beak so that there's a smaller area being evaluated. To get started, I'll first erase the existing highlight there. So I'll choose the Eraser tool. Note that you can adjust the size of the eraser with the pop-up. I'll go ahead and use the larger size to make my work here a little bit quicker. And then I will paint over the area of that edge that I need to correct. So just using the eraser to erase that yellow highlight so that I can paint once again at a smaller size. So I'll go ahead and once again choose the Magic Edge tool, and I can specify a size. In this case, to make sure I'm getting the best result, I'll use the smallest size, the 1 setting there for the brush. And then I will paint along the edge of the top of the toucan's beak very carefully following right along the edge of the beak where there was difficulty with the initial extraction from the background. That looks to be much better, so I'll go ahead and click the Convert button in order to once again process that image, and you can see that I now have a much better result along the top edge of the beak of the bird. I'll go ahead and expand that view so that we can evaluate the result. I'll zoom out so we can see more of the bird. And then, of course, I could preview in a variety of ways. I'll start off by clicking the second preview option, which enables me to see a dark overlay on the foreground object and then a red outline identifying the edge of that object. So I can use that to help make sure that that edge was detected accurately. I can remove the dark overlay from my foreground object with the last option. In most cases, though, I find that it's more helpful to evaluate with a completely different color set against the foreground object that we extracted from the background. So I'll go back to that first preview option, and then I'll click the pop-up to the left to bring up the color picker where I can choose a color that I would like to put behind my foreground object, behind the toucan in this case, and I could use a variety of different colors to get a sense of whether or not I have a good extraction here, whether the background has been removed effectively. In this case, I think we have a good result, so I could just take a look at the last couple of options here. I could determine whether or not I want to crop automatically, which is the default, cropping to the edge of the object that was extracted. I could turn off the auto checkbox and then specify the position using X and Y coordinates and the size with width and height values for the actual crop box. So I could reduce the size of that crop box, for example, in terms of the width or the height, for example, to tighten up my cropping on the toucan and then adjust the position of that crop box as needed. But in general, I think you'll find that simply leaving the auto checkbox turned on will work well. We can also add a shadow to the foreground object that was extracted. The pop-up allows you to determine the size for that shadow, and you can specify a feathering amount or a blending amount along the edge of the extracted object. In most cases, you'll want at least a small degree of feathering, and with fuzzy objects, you might need a little bit more. The default value is 5. Here, I have a combination of a beak with a crisp edge and feathers with some fuzzy edges. I might increase that feathering just a little bit to accommodate the feathers. But now I'm happy with my results, so I'm ready to add this extracted image, the image with the background removed, back to my button design. First, note that with the gear icon here, I can specify whether I want a PNG image, an image with transparency, or a JPEG image which does not support transparency, but for which you could choose your own background color. So, for example, putting white as your background color. In general, I recommend using the PNG option, and then to add the extracted image to your button design, you can simply click the Add to Canvas button. You can see that the background has been completely removed from my toucan image so that the rest of my button design is able to show through. I'll go ahead and adjust the size of the image here a little bit and reposition my toucan, maybe something about like that. But as you can see, it's possible to remove a background from a photo even when that background is a bit complicated.